I packed the pie and gift into the car, checked the time, and left with a cautious kind of optimism. The drive was quiet, a few old jazz songs on the radio. I rehearsed small talk in my head. I wondered if the candles would be lit, if my father would hug me, if maybe, just maybe, there'd be a chair waiting. I told myself not to expect too much. But the truth is, I still did. And that's the cruelest kind of erasure. Not the kind that's loud and cruel, but the kind wrapped in silence, in omission, in walking into a room and realizing they've already written the story without you in it. The table was long, rectangular, polished to a soft sheen. I remember how the glasses caught the chandelier light, little prisms reflecting amber wine and overhead glow. 12 settings, each one perfectly placed. Napkin folds sharp, forks aligned like soldiers. I'd noticed that first, even before I realized I wasn't among them. It was a kind of precision my stepmother prided herself on. Hosting was her sport. Seating was strategy. Who sat where told you everything about who mattered. My father was at the head, of course, carving station behind him like some symbol of status. My stepmother beside him, her mother across. Cameron and his wife flanked the center like royalty, seated in the middle of court. Cousins, neighbors, and 2 friends of the family, people I barely recognized, rounded out the rest. I wasn't just excluded, I was replaced. There were only 12 chairs because someone made the list. Someone chose who fit. I stood there for a moment too long, hands still full, watching as the group pretended not to notice me noticing. That's the part that sticks with you, the collective silence. How it turns complicity into choreography. I watched as someone I hadn't seen in years leaned over to Cameron, whispered something behind a half laugh. He looked at me, didn't flinch, and grinned. They were comfortable. That was the worst part. No shame. Just the smug confidence of people who believe their version of the story will always be the one that sticks. I tried not to look for my father's eyes, but I did. He was studying his plate. When I was younger, I thought silence meant safety. That if I didn't make waves, I'd stay afloat. That if I showed up, worked hard, stayed kind, I'd be seen. But silence doesn't keep you safe. It just teaches people how to ignore you more efficiently. I thought about saying something, about asking calmly if I'd missed a message, if there'd been a change. But I didn't. I already knew the answer. The missing chair wasn't an oversight. It was an outcome. I set the pie down like it mattered, like it still had a place. I placed the gift next to it, careful not to crumple the ribbon. I kept my hands steady even as my stomach turned. My brother caught my eye then, and in his smirk, I saw confirmation. He knew. He always knew. The only question was why they'd gone through the trouble of inviting me at all. Maybe they wanted the appearance of civility. Maybe it amused them. Maybe they expected me to cause a scene, give them something to point at, to blame. But I didn't give them that. I never have. I adjusted the sleeve of my dress, took one last look at the table, and stepped away. No seat, no apology, no pretense of inclusion, just a table set with 12 names, and mine never spoken aloud. The door closed behind me with a soft final click. No slamming, no dramatics, just the sound of decision. Of a woman stepping away from a table that never made room. The night air bit at my cheeks as I walked to the car, heels tapping sharp against the pavement. The porch light behind me cast a long shadow. For a moment, I stood at the edge of the driveway, the pie still untouched in my hands, the gift still wrapped. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but there was no flood, just a kind of stillness, brittle and pure, like cold glass. Humiliation doesn't always come as heat. Sometimes it comes as quiet. A hum in the bones. A hollow where belonging used to sit. I opened the car door and placed the pie gently in the passenger seat. The tea towel had shifted, revealing the browned edge of the crust. I'd been so careful with it. Pressed the lattice into perfect diagonals. Brushed it with egg wash. It smelled like cinnamon and patience. No one in that house would ever taste it. I sat for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, watching the light spill out from the dining room window. Through the sheer curtain, I could see silhouettes move. Plates passed, glasses raised. Laughter, muffled but clear, broke through every few seconds. None of them noticed I was gone. Or maybe they did. Maybe they were glad. I considered going home, but the thought of walking into my apartment, flicking on the hallway light, and setting the untouched pie on my counter felt too heavy. I needed distance, not familiarity. I needed a place that didn't echo with the absence of kindness. So I drove to a hotel, a modest one, business travel plane. Clean sheets, dim lighting, beige carpeting that muted every footstep. I didn't speak to the clerk beyond the basics. ID, credit card, a polite nod. I took the elevator up alone. When the door closed, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. Hair still neat, lipstick faded just enough to show the shape of my mouth. Eyes steady. I looked like someone who had just come from a nice dinner. But inside, I was hollowed. In the room, I peeled off the dress slowly, hung it on the back of the chair. The pie sat on the table untouched, like an accusation. I turned off the lights and stood by the window, watching traffic drift past on the highway. That's when I remembered the envelope in my purse. Cream cardstock, heavy with truth. I hadn't brought it as revenge. I'd brought it as a last resort, a mirror held steady. They didn't deserve to see it tonight, but one day they would. I stood there, bathed in the soft glow of unfamiliar light, and felt something settle. Not anger, not sadness, just resolve. The envelope wasn't an afterthought. I'd packed it before the pie, before the gift, before I'd even ironed my dress. It was the first thing I touched that morning, placed deliberately into my bag, its weight unmistakable. Not heavy in size, but in meaning. Inside was history, not the kind you share in scrapbooks or over old wine. This was the kind you build in silence, the kind you gather piece by piece while everyone else assumes you're too polite to keep score. Emails, screenshots, copies of legal documents, texts he thought I'd deleted. It began 2 years ago, when the tension with my brother stopped being subtle and started becoming structural. He'd always been slippery with truth, but it wasn't until after Dad's first hospital scare that I noticed the shifting lines. Inheritance talk had started surfacing, quietly at first. Hushed conversations in the hallway, whispered opinions on what Dad really wanted. And then one day, I found the draft, an unsigned will, edited and saved on our shared cloud folder. The phrasing had changed, subtly but enough. Assets reallocated, trusts redirected, my name missing in places it had once belonged. When I asked Cameron about it, he laughed. Probably just an old version, he said, sipping his drink without looking up. You know, Dad changes his mind all the time. But the file had a date, a timestamp, a trail. That was the day I started keeping records. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. The emails he sent Dad about me, dismissive, clipped, always suggesting I was too busy, too distant, too selfish to be involved. The conversations I never knew were happening behind my back. The decisions made without me and explained after the fact. Every time I visited, I was told things had already been handled, that my input wasn't needed, that I shouldn't worry. And when I pushed, I became difficult. The narrative shifted like smoke, slippery and hard to pin. But I learned to follow the smoke back to its source. The envelope held it all. There was the email Cameron sent to the estate lawyer on behalf of the family, requesting changes Dad never mentioned to me. The bank statements showing withdrawals aligned with joint expenses I hadn't been part of. Screenshots of texts where he claimed I was uninterested, unavailable, even hostile. None of it was explosive. That was the genius of it. Death by 1,000 implications. He never said, "I want her out." He simply made it easier for people to forget I was ever in, and I had let it go on for years until I didn't. That envelope wasn't a threat. It was a record, one they never thought I'd build, quietly, carefully, in a folder marked simply with my initials, M.E. What they didn't know was that I hadn't come to the dinner for reconciliation. I came to deliver the truth. They just hadn't earned the privilege of hearing it yet. It didn't start with the missing chair. It started long before, with small omissions that stacked themselves into something heavier. The kind of weight you don't feel all at once. You just notice your back hurting, your chest tightening, your voice shrinking. When I was 12, they forgot to tell me about Cameron's science fair. I found out 2 days later when I saw the ribbon on the fridge and heard the stories at dinner. I'd been in my room that night doing homework the same way I always did. No one came to get me. When I was 17, my stepmother hosted a brunch for Cameron's acceptance into university. I was also accepted, same month, different school, but mine got a quiet congrats over the sink while she loaded the dishwasher. They didn't yell. They didn't criticize. They just moved around me like I wasn't there. It was never about conflict. It was about omission. And omission is harder to prove, harder to confront. You can't hold someone accountable for the thing they didn't say, the party they didn't invite you to, the photo you weren't in. There's always a reason. A calendar mix-up, a miscommunication. I thought you were busy. Busy. That was the word they used, like punctuation. She's busy with work. She probably doesn't want to come to something so small. Miranda's always off doing something important. At some point, that turned into permission to leave me out entirely. And when I said calmly, I'd like to be included, I was met with bewildered smiles. Of course, darling, it was just a misunderstanding. Except misunderstandings don't repeat themselves for 2 decades. The most painful part wasn't the exclusion itself. It was the way no one ever acknowledged it. No apologies, no recognition, just a subtle shift in the weather every time I entered a room, like someone had opened a window and let the air out. Even my father, once attentive, had started falling in line with the narrative they fed him. That I was strong, independent, self-sufficient, that I didn't need the same things Cameron did, and because I never shouted, never stormed out, never made them confront their choices, they kept making them. You learn eventually to stop asking, to smile tightly when you're introduced as my husband's daughter instead of just Miranda, to nod when someone forgets your birthday but remembers your brother's down to the hour. You learn to wear the invisibility like a second skin. Until one day, it doesn't fit anymore. That's what the dinner was. Not a one-time betrayal. A culmination. Every empty chair before that one. Every moment I swallowed disappointment to keep peace. Every time I left a room quieter than I entered it, hoping silence would earn respect. It didn't. So I built something instead. Something louder than rage, but spoken in pages. And this time, I wouldn't leave quietly. Cameron has always been golden. That was the word they used. Golden. As if he radiated something the rest of us didn't. My father called it charisma. My stepmother called it charm. Teachers said he had presence. Even when he barely studied, even when his grades wavered, there was always a cushion waiting to catch him. A soft landing, an excuse. He smiled through every mistake, and people smiled back. But I knew better, because I watched him lie with a casual grace that didn't raise alarms. I watched him twist facts just enough to escape blame. He didn't need to be cruel. He just needed to be convincing. And he was very good at that. When our father had his first health scare, a minor stroke that scared everyone more than it harmed, Cameron stepped in. Not because he wanted to, but because he saw an opening. He took over communication with the doctors, handled appointments, managed the estate paperwork to take the burden off. That's what he told me anyway, but what he didn't say was that he'd started adjusting things. Calling meetings without me, suggesting changes in Dad's long-standing will, and slowly he began to redraw the map of what belonged to whom. He didn't forge anything. Not in the way that leaves ink trails. He was smarter than that. He used suggestion, manipulation, the kind that sounds helpful on the surface. Dad's getting older. It's just cleaner this way. You're busy with work. I've got it covered. At first, I believed him. I wanted to. I was too tired to fight a brother who smiled while stabbing. But then, I found the draft, a version of the will I'd never seen. Same letterhead, same lawyer, different language. Suddenly, assets that were once meant to be split were marked for designated beneficiaries, with Cameron listed explicitly. My name absent, entire paragraphs redacted and replaced. I confronted him. He shrugged. Said Dad was thinking about simplifying things. But I knew my father's handwriting, and I knew it wasn't on that draft. That was when the folder began, not just for the estate, for everything. Bank transfers marked as joint expenses, but leading only to Cameron's accounts. Venmo screenshots with vague labels like reimbursement for costs we never discussed. Photos of dinners, he claimed, were for Dad's care, but looked a lot like nights out. He thought no one was watching. He thought being the favorite meant he was untouchable. But favorites forget something. Those left behind see everything. Cameron always knew how to play to the room. He made jokes before questions could land. Deflected with charm, masked greed as concern. And the family let him, because it was easier to believe in his shine than to see the shadow beneath it. But I had no more room for illusions. The mask had slipped, and I had every receipt. There's something strangely calming about collecting proof. It gives shape to things that once felt slippery. It removes doubt, not just for others, but for yourself. You stop asking, was it really that bad? You stop gaslighting your own memory. You start naming things clearly. I wasn't building a case to ruin Cameron. I was building one so I'd never second guess myself again. It started with a spreadsheet. One tab for financial discrepancies. Venmo payments, account withdrawals, reimbursed expenses that never went both ways. I went back 6 years. Every transaction I could track. Every receipt I'd saved out of habit now had a purpose. Then came the emails. Screenshots of conversations between Cameron and our father, casually excluding me from updates. One stood out. "I'll take care of this. Miranda's got too much on her plate." No consultation, just assumption. Always with that tone of false helpfulness, like cutting me out was doing me a favor. I added it to the folder. Next were the legal documents. Copies of the estate planning notes I'd taken during Dad's healthier years. I had them because I was the one who used to organize the files. I still remembered where they were kept back when I was trusted with logistics, before Cameron decided it was his domain. The newer drafts didn't match. Sections had been softened, stripped, rewritten. I found an old email from Dad, dated 2 years earlier, where he'd said plainly, "Everything will be divided evenly. That's what's fair." But the draft Cameron submitted to the lawyer 6 months later told a different story. I printed them both. Stapled the contrast. The folder grew thick. Tabbed, sorted, indexed. I wasn't chaotic about it. I was methodical, precise. The way I used to be when managing high-stakes events, keeping dignitaries from crossing paths, making sure dinner was served on time down to the second. This wasn't rage. This was muscle memory. There was a power in seeing it laid out, patterned, confirmed. A betrayal that didn't hide in feelings, but stood plain in numbers, dates, words. When the folder was full, I made a second copy. One was sealed. The other I kept open. Not because I needed to reread it, but because I needed to see it. To know I hadn't imagined the dismissal, the manipulation, the quiet theft of space that had been mine. Not just financially, but relationally, emotionally, historically. I had spent years being careful, considerate, measured, and still, I had been sidelined. So now I was done being careful. They made a mistake inviting me to that dinner. They thought I would come quietly, absorb the slight, and retreat like I always had. But I didn't come to be fed. I came to serve notice. And that folder? It was my invitation, written in proof. I didn't know exactly how I'd deliver it. That was the part I hadn't settled on. The method, the moment, the reveal, but the intention was clear long before the dinner. The envelope wasn't for drama. It wasn't a grenade. It was a mirror. Simple, flat, unadorned, meant to reflect exactly what they'd done. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes when you no longer care to be liked. When you realize that chasing grace in people who keep erasing you is like pouring water into a cracked glass. It seeps out every time, and still you keep filling it. I wasn't there for reconciliation. I was there for record. The envelope was cream cardstock, thick, elegant, the kind you use for wedding invitations. Inside was a digest version of the folder. Not the full archive, but enough. A curated timeline of betrayal. Copies of emails, printouts of altered documents, side-by-side comparisons of will revisions, dates and names circled in pen. A short letter at the front. No salutation, no closing, just a single sentence typed in a bold, clean font. This is what you've done, and I am no longer quiet. I sealed it with clear tape, folded the edge twice so it couldn't accidentally slip open. I placed it flat inside my bag, beneath the pie and the shawl, like a letter to history, meant to be discovered, not announced. The day of the dinner, I held it the way you'd carry a verdict, not with fear, with certainty. I didn't know if I'd hand it to Cameron directly. I didn't know if I'd place it by his seat or slip it into his coat pocket before walking out. What I did know was that it wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about watching him react. It was about leaving the truth behind like a lit fuse and walking away before the flame reached the edge. People think revenge is loud, explosive, but the kind that lingers, the kind that haunts, is the one that whispers, the kind you don't see.
Coming, because it doesn't yell, it doesn't even knock, it just appears. Undeniable, unapologetic. I had no need for spectacle, no need to stand up in front of the table and demand my place. They'd made their choices, laid them out like silverware, and I'd made mine. So I dressed with care, slid the envelope into the lining of my tote, fastened the clasp. And when I arrived at that house and saw that empty space where my name should have been, I knew exactly where to leave it. Not as a cry for attention, but as a record they could never erase. The truth, finally printed, and left behind like an echo they couldn't talk over. No one saw me slip it in. Cameron's coat was hanging over the back of his chair, half draped, as if even his clothing assumed it belonged. I brushed past on my way out, quiet, deliberate, and tucked the envelope into the inner pocket where he always kept his phone. It fit perfectly. He didn't notice. None of them did. They were too busy pretending not to see me, too absorbed in their wine glasses and overlapping laughter, in the performance of family unity. I didn't need a spotlight to make my move. I needed only precision, timing, the silence I'd been trained to carry. The gift and the pie stayed on the counter. I never intended to take them back, let them sit there, untouched, a reminder of the version of me they preferred, the one who showed up with something sweet and left without asking why she was never truly included. The air outside was colder than I remembered. I walked straight to the car, my steps even, my chin high. No tears, no trembling, just clarity. It wasn't the kind you feel with triumph. It was cleaner than that. Emptier. Like shedding weight you didn't know you'd been carrying for years. As I pulled out of the driveway, I didn't look back. I drove past familiar houses on that quiet suburban street, every porch light warm, every window glowing like a staged illusion. This neighborhood had always felt like a set to me. Smiling people in curated homes, candles lit, drapes drawn just enough to hint at perfection. But I knew better. The moment the wheels hit the main road, I exhaled, a long, slow release, like the kind you take after surfacing from deep underwater. I hadn't realized how long I'd been holding my breath. Years, maybe. At a red light, I glanced over at the passenger seat. The space where the pie had sat was now empty. But I imagined the envelope, resting quietly in Cameron's coat, pressed against his phone, waiting for him to find it. I didn't picture his reaction. I didn't need to. Because this wasn't about what he'd say. It was about what he couldn't undo. He could spin stories. He could charm the room, but he couldn't unprint what was in that envelope. Couldn't erase the dates, the names, the edits. Couldn't talk over paper. I checked into the hotel an hour later. Neutral walls, a bed turned down with machine precision, lamps that glowed just enough to feel sterile. I slid my shoes off and stood by the window, watching headlights blur across the highway. The silence in that room felt different. Not lonely, just earned. They had built their table with 12 seats. They'd excluded me with care, and so I had returned the gesture, with evidence. No confrontation, no performance, just paper and an empty chair. It started just after midnight. A missed call from my brother. No voicemail. Then a text. What the hell is this? No greeting, no punctuation, just those 5 words, heavy with the weight of exposure. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned my phone face down on the nightstand, took a sip of the tea I'd brought up from the lobby, and settled deeper beneath the hotel's thin comforter. The air was too still to sleep, but I wasn't restless, just watching, waiting. The second message came 15 minutes later. You're seriously going to do this now? At her birthday? I almost laughed. The irony of him choosing timing as the issue. As if there's ever a convenient moment to confront theft disguised as loyalty. As if his betrayal would have been more palatable on a Tuesday. I left the phone silent. In the morning, the voicemail started. My stepmother, her voice too bright and too fast. Miranda, I don't know what you're trying to do, but this is very inappropriate. You've upset everyone. We'll talk later, privately. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a shift in tone. The same one she used when Cameron dented her car as a teenager. Not angry, just embarrassed, inconvenienced. Then my father. His voice was quieter, hesitant. I don't understand what's going on here. Cam says there's been a mistake. Maybe we should all just sit down and talk, yeah? No need to make things bigger than they are. Bigger than they are. As if this was about a single envelope. As if I hadn't been collecting receipts for years. As if the theft was somehow secondary to the discomfort of confronting it. I didn't return his call either. That afternoon, from my seat at the cafe across from the hotel, I watched the messages stack. A cousin reaching out in a whisper. I saw what you put in that envelope. Is it true? Another. If this goes legal, I'm staying out of it. I never asked them to choose sides. But silence makes sides for you. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't looking for allies. I wasn't orchestrating a takedown. I wasn't interested in vengeance. I was interested in record. In truth. In letting a history that had been revised in whispers finally be read aloud. Back at the hotel, I pulled the backup folder from my bag, flipped through the pages with clean, steady fingers. The proof hadn't changed overnight, but its weight had. They weren't angry about what I'd done. They were angry I'd done it quietly, without warning. Without the mess they could blame on emotion, but I hadn't flinched. I hadn't raised my voice. I'd simply left the truth in their hands and walked away. And now they had to decide what to do with it. That was never my part. Mine was just to begin the unraveling. They didn't call it what it was. They called it drama, confusion, some kind of misunderstanding. But the truth has a way of uncoiling once it's released. You can't stuff it back into silence. Not when the facts are dated, signed, printed. Not when the handwriting on the will doesn't match. Not when the numbers are circled in red and they lead to only one name, Cameron. I heard through a cousin, Sarah, the quiet one with a knack for sitting just outside the blast zone, that things at the house unraveled quickly after I left. My brother found the envelope when he reached for his phone. Right there at the table, surrounded by laughter and second helpings, he pulled it out. Read the first page, and then the next. Silence spread like spilled wine. He tried to laugh it off at first. Guess Miranda brought homework, he said, waving the envelope like a joke. But then he saw the transaction logs, the altered clauses, the screenshots. Sarah said his face changed in stages. First amusement, then confusion, then something sharper. His fingers tightened around the edge of the envelope. He stopped talking. My stepmother leaned over, skimmed the top sheet, and whispered something harsh under her breath. A few others craned their necks to peek. Someone asked quietly, "What is that?"
The answer was on page 3. By the time he reached the timeline I'd assembled, the one with side-by-side records of what had been agreed and what had been done, he wasn't laughing anymore. They didn't know what to do with it. Couldn't decide whether to call it fake or overblown. My father asked to see it, voice flat. He read slowly, lips moving as his eyes scanned the printed proof. Sarah said he sat back in his chair, rubbed his forehead, and didn't speak for a long time. No one ate dessert. I pictured the pie still sitting there, untouched. A quiet metaphor. Sweetness offered to a table that had no appetite for truth. Later that night, Cameron sent me one more text. You really think this proves something? It did, but not to him. The proof wasn't for debate. It wasn't an argument. It was a mirror. And what people see in mirrors depends entirely on what they've been pretending not to notice. Some of them stayed quiet. Others reached out privately with careful messages. I had no idea. This explains a lot. I'm sorry we didn't see it sooner. But their apologies weren't the point. The point was, they couldn't unsee it now. I didn't need to fight to be heard. I just needed to leave the right words in the right hands. Truth delivered without ceremony, without spectacle. And in that stillness, something started to break. Not me, them. The next morning I woke without an alarm. No buzzing phone, no meeting reminder, no obligations demanding a response. Just sunlight slanting through the thin hotel curtains and the soft hum of traffic far below. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the urge to check my messages. I knew what would be there. More confusion, more spin, maybe even attempts at reconciliation disguised as outrage. But none of it mattered anymore, not to who I'd become overnight. I made coffee from the small machine by the sink and took it out onto the tiny balcony. The view wasn't much, just rooftops, power lines, and a narrow stretch of highway, but it was high enough to give me distance. And right now, that was the only view I needed. I thought about the silence I used to fear. How I used to fill it with excuses, over-explaining, trying to smooth the edges of other people's discomfort. But silence, I've come to realize, isn't absence. It's space. And sometimes, space is the only way to hear yourself think again. I wrapped the hotel robe tighter around me and let the coffee warm my palms. It was quiet out here. And in that quiet, I let myself go back. Not to the betrayal, but to before, to the years I spent working late, sending birthday cards, showing up early to help with decorations, to the countless dinners where I was the one offering to clean up, to bring dessert, to make things easier. I remembered standing in my kitchen baking that pie, believing, on some fragile level, that this time might be different. That's what hurt the most. Not the absence of a chair, but the presence of hope I still hadn't fully let go of. That part of me, the one who still wanted to belong, she had to die. Quietly, in a hotel room, wrapped in a robe, sipping coffee over rooftops. That's where I buried her. Not with bitterness, but with mercy. She didn't fail. She just waited too long to stop shrinking. From that height, I could still see their world, the house, the table, the performance. But it didn't pull me in anymore. It was just scenery now. A distant, well-lit stage I'd once mistaken for home. I spent the rest of the morning writing, not to them, not to explain myself, just to write it out. I wrote about the moments I'd ignored, the instincts I'd silenced, the lines I'd crossed to keep peace with people who were never at war with me, only with a version of me they couldn't control. And when I finished, I didn't feel lighter. I felt centered, like something had finally returned to its rightful place. I wasn't part of that family the way they wanted me to be, but I wasn't lost anymore. I was whole.
By the second day, the messages changed tone. They were no longer laced with sarcasm or denial. They came softer now, filtered through hesitation, shaped by damage already done, like smoke curling from the edges of something already burning. The first was from Aunt Celia. A text, short and unsure. I read the documents. If even half of it's true, I'm sorry we didn't see it sooner. She was the only one who didn't ask for a call. She didn't ask for explanations, just an acknowledgement, tentative but real. I held my phone for a long time before responding. Thank you for reading. That was all. Some apologies don't need to be dissected. Some just need to land. Later that evening, my father called again. This time I let it ring through, then played the voicemail in the dark. His voice was subdued, tired in a way I hadn't heard before. Miranda, I don't know how this all happened. I should have paid more attention. I should have asked more questions. I didn't mean for things to go this far. There was a pause, heavy, unscripted. I guess I let Cameron handle too much. I thought he was just being helpful. I never imagined. His voice broke slightly. Anyway, I'm sorry. I really am. It wasn't perfect, but it was the closest thing to accountability I'd ever heard from him. And strangely, I didn't feel the surge of satisfaction I thought I might. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still. Because the apology wasn't a currency I needed anymore. I wasn't waiting for it to justify what I'd done. I didn't need his voice to validate my evidence. The facts stood on their own now. What mattered more was that he saw them. That maybe, for once, he saw me. I didn't call back right away. Instead, I wrote a letter. Not to send, but to say the things I'd never been given space to speak. I wrote about how I learned to read rooms before I read books. How I noticed who got praised and who got passed over. How it shaped me. The quiet girl who carried responsibility like a second skin, while others coasted on charm. I wrote about the years I stayed silent. The holidays I left early. The moments I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. And I ended it with one line. I'm not angry anymore, but I won't step back into a room where I'm expected to disappear. It was a vow, not a demand. Because this wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. Mine. I folded the letter and placed it in my journal. Not for him. For me. To mark the moment where I chose clarity over closeness. Where I understood that some relationships, even blood-bound ones, aren't worth shrinking yourself to keep. They'd built their fire without me. Now they had to sit in the ashes. Families don't fall apart all at once. They fracture in quiet ways, through glances not returned, calls not made, truths ignored. And once a crack forms, it spreads. Over the next week, the responses trickled in. Aunt Celia reached out again, this time with more certainty. She asked to meet for coffee. No pressure, she said, just to listen. No fixing. I believed her. A cousin unfollowed me on every platform. Another one, surprisingly, sent a
private message. We always wondered how Cameron got Dad to change the will. Now I know. No warmth, just facts. But that was fine. I wasn't asking for love, just for clarity. My stepmother never called. But I heard from Sarah again, quiet, observant Sarah, who said she overheard her say, Miranda's always been dramatic. She just hides it behind quiet. Dramatic. For documenting theft, for not making a scene, for leaving proof instead of starting a fight. It was almost laughable. Cameron, of course, didn't apologize. His last message was a single sentence. This is going to tear the family apart. As if I'd caused the tear. As if his years of silent sabotage were just rough edges. As if the only real betrayal was shining a light on what he did. That's the thing about manipulators. They mourn the exposure more than the harm. I didn't respond. Because by then, I understood something I should have accepted long ago. You don't heal in the same place you were erased. And I'd been trying to build connection in a house that was never mine. Not really. I went home that Friday. Not to them. To my apartment. My own space. I unpacked slowly, lit a candle, washed the pie dish that had sat untouched in my back seat. There was a strange grace in that. Cleaning something that never fulfilled its purpose. I repotted the plant my stepmother had once given me. Not to preserve the memory, but to give it new soil, a fresh start. Something green that didn't owe its roots to anyone but me. The call slowed. The tension, I knew, didn't fade. It just moved underground. But I'd stepped off that battlefield. Some relationships tried to rebuild. Others didn't. And I let both outcomes be what they were. Celia and I did meet for coffee. She came with no defenses, no justifications, just quiet remorse and open ears. We didn't rehash everything. We didn't need to. She said simply, "You deserved better." And I believed her. That was the only restoration I accepted. The rest, I released. Because peace isn't found in forcing what's broken to hold. It's found in knowing what's worth carrying forward. Cameron's silence became its own confession. My stepmother's denial, its own verdict. And the family, once knitted together by illusion, now sat divided, not by my envelope, but by their own refusal to see me clearly. Some of them looked closer, some turned away. And I didn't chase either. It took a week before my apartment felt like mine again. Not because anything had changed inside it, but because I had. I moved differently now. Quieter, but firmer. More certain. Like someone who'd returned from something they couldn't quite name. The envelope was no longer in my bag. The folder, once on my desk, had been filed away under personal archive, not hidden, just complete. There was nothing more to add, no postscript needed. One evening, I stood in the center of my living room, holding a framed photo I'd nearly taken down months ago. It was me and my father, years back, at my college graduation. His arm slung around my shoulder, my smile wide and hopeful. I'd once looked at it and wondered if that version of him had disappeared entirely. If that day had been real or just another stage in the performance. Now, I didn't need the answer. I placed the frame back on the shelf. Not as a tribute, as a record. A snapshot of something that once existed without letting it define the present. Healing doesn't come with grand gestures. It comes in the way you let the air settle again, in the way you make tea without tension in your chest, in the way you sleep without rehearsing conversations that never come. I opened a fresh notebook, linen-bound, blank pages, and wrote a single word at the top of the first page, here. Because that's where I was now, not back there, not trapped in their unfinished narratives. Not waiting for closure to come from mouths that only knew silence or spin. Here, where the quiet wasn't about suppression but sovereignty, where I didn't have to prove anything to be seen. I reorganized my bookshelf. I bought fresh flowers. I tossed the last of the leftovers from that week into the trash. Cleansing, small but deliberate. And I took the pie dish, the one I'd carefully carried and never served, and used it that Sunday. this time for myself. A fresh peach tart, just enough sweetness, just enough salt. I ate it warm, barefoot in the kitchen, the window cracked open to let in the evening breeze. No performance, no audience, just me, reclaiming the rituals they tried to make meaningless. They thought I came to that dinner to plead for inclusion. They thought my silence was submission. But silence, used well, is a scalpel, not a muzzle. And I had used mine with precision. What remained now was mine. Not because they gave it to me, but because I took it.
Back, cleanly. No revenge, no spectacle, just truth. Served cold, in a home that finally echoed with only my name. The gift sat in the back seat for 3 more days. I hadn't meant to take it with me. In the haze of that night, I'd set it down, then picked it up again without thinking. Reflex, maybe? Or instinct. It didn't belong on their counter anymore. It didn't belong anywhere near them. The shawl was still inside, soft wool, heather gray, warm enough for cool evenings. I'd folded it carefully, wrapped it in tissue, tucked in a handwritten card that said, "For the colder days ahead." I'd meant it literally, but also not. I didn't open the bag again, didn't take out the note. I thought briefly about donating it, about leaving it on a park bench with no return address. But it wasn't just fabric anymore. It was the last piece of me that had tried to extend something gentle to a family that only reached when it served them. On the 4th morning, I dropped it in the trash. Not out of spite, but because sometimes letting go means removing even the things that once held good intention. They never saw the gift, never unwrapped the softness, never read the words I'd written. And that felt right, in the end. They'd never really seen me either. I stood at the kitchen sink later, washing a few dishes, and thought about all the offerings I'd made over the years, the invitations extended, the silence endured, the grace given, sometimes too freely. Each one a small gift they didn't recognize, or worse, expected. I used to think being generous would eventually earn me a place. That if I kept giving, someone would look up and say, "She matters." That I could carve belonging out of effort. But effort, without reciprocity, is just erosion. So I stopped offering. Not because I'd become bitter, but because I'd become clear. There was no grief left in that decision, only release. The pie dish, now clean, sat drying by the sink. The space it had occupied in my car, now empty. The corner of the closet where I kept event clothes, dresses chosen to impress them, was 1 hanger lighter. I felt lighter too. I'd spent so long bracing for impact that peace almost felt suspicious. But it wasn't. It was mine. Earned, built, brick by quiet brick. Later that night, I wrote in my journal, "Some things don't need to be returned. They just need to be put down." That gift wasn't wasted. It was simply misplaced. Because the colder days ahead were never meant to be hers. They were mine. And I was ready for them, not wrapped in expectation, but in truth, in stillness, and in the warm, deliberate choice to stop giving myself to people who never planned to open the gift. It was a Tuesday when I closed the account. Not a symbolic day, not an anniversary or a milestone, just a Tuesday. But that made it perfect, because finality, when it's real, doesn't need fanfare. It needs follow-through. The bank branch was quiet, fluorescent lights, plastic pens on chains, that faint, sterile scent of printer paper and restraint. I stood in line behind a woman depositing birthday checks and a man asking about overdraft fees. When it was my turn, I stepped forward and said simply, I'd like to close a joint account. It's been flagged. I want it gone. The woman behind the counter didn't flinch. She pulled up the file, clicked through tabs, printed forms. It's already frozen, she confirmed. We just need your signature to finalize closure. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. 2 signatures, a final click, and then she slid the receipt across the counter. You're all set. I folded the paper and slipped it into my wallet. On the walkout, I passed the same parking lot where I once sat, gripping a pie and a gift, pretending there might still be space for me at a table that had never been mine. The light outside was flat and clean. No drama, no sting, just clarity. The account was closed, not just the financial one, all of it. The emotional ledgers I kept, the debt of proving I belonged, the overdrafts of grace I kept extending without return. At home, I took the receipt and added it to the back of the folder. One last page, like a period at the end of a long, precise sentence. Then I sealed the folder in an envelope, labeled it with nothing but the date, and slid it into my filing cabinet under Personal Archive, not for rereading, just for record. In its place on the desk, I stacked new notebooks, blank pages, no names written in the margins except mine. That night, I sat on my balcony with a cup of mint tea. The city buzzed below, kids on skateboards, buses sighing to a stop, a dog barking 2 blocks away. Life moved on, as it always does. But this time, I moved with it. No ghosts trailing, no noise behind me, just the sound of breath in my chest and the steady rhythm of being finished, not defeated, finished. There's a difference, because what I ended wasn't a family. It was a performance. And what I reclaimed wasn't revenge. It was my name, my place, my peace. I still get banking alerts, little chimes that used to signal dread. Now, they just mean awareness, vigilance, a woman who pays attention, not because she's afraid, but because she remembers what it costs to stop watching. The account is closed, and so is the chapter, on my terms, without apology, without permission, and without ever needing to raise my voice.